Hey everybody, it's Dr. Sam.
And Sandria. Happy Juneteenth, y'all.
Welcome to Black to the Beginning, where we are amplifying the Black adoption conversation with Black adoptee voices and Black families at the center. We are excited about today's discussion for a few reasons. First, we are going to be interviewing a Black male adoptee. Let me say that again for you all.
Right.
Black male adoptee. I'm putting emphasis on this because when it comes to adoption, whether it be from the foster care system or private adoption agencies, Black males are the least likely to find themselves in loving and stable homes. We will also be discussing Black fatherhood, which is very much alive. Despite the Black fathers are absent myth, our guest will explore his Black fatherhood journey as an adoptee.
Joining us today is one of my favorite people, Kevin Anthony Johnson. Kevin was adopted and raised in the Midwest, where he overcame the pull of homelessness in early adulthood and forged his own way as an entrepreneur, creative, and executive coach to public servants, startups, and executives at billion-dollar companies. He's the author of 2 books, an artist and philosopher, but most proudly, he's the father of 3 thriving young adults who are making change in the world. All right, we are gonna go Black to the beginning. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me, Dr. Sam and Sandra.
Yes, truly an honor. So we wanna start Black at the beginning and take us through your adoption story. And I know that's kind of a loaded question, but just take us back to where that begins for you. Was it kinship adoption? Was it private agency? Where does your adoption story begin?
Well, actually, it began on television. I was, well, let me back up. My mother, my adoptive mother, Mary Johnson, had lost 3 straight pregnancies to miscarriage. And one day she was sitting down watching television, I think some Young and the Restless or some soap opera back in the day, and a commercial ran by Catholic Social Services that showed some kids that were up for adoption. And so it compelled her to ask her husband, John, can we adopt? And after some discussion, they agreed, yeah, let's do that. And so they went down to the Catholic Social Service Agency to look through the catalog, as was their manner in the day. It was kind of like going through a Sears catalog to shop for babies. And lo and behold, the kid that was in the commercial was in the adoption book. And my mother wasn't aware that that was actually what was going to happen. But she gets there and she sees my picture in the book. My picture matches my face from the TV commercial. So I've been on TV since 1970-ish, somewhere in there.
You were born for this, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I've been looking for that footage for a long time. So if anybody who sees this knows how to get access to commercials from that long ago, hook a brother up. I would love to have that full circle.
Yeah.
So they literally found me that way. And I always look at it like I have 3 mothers. I have my mother who gave birth to me and gave me up. I have the mother who kept me for 2 years, from 70 to 72-ish, during the adoption process. Don't know who that is, somebody in the Catholic Social Service system. And then no records. I've already looked exhaustively. And then my mom who adopted me. And so I look at that as this triune of motherhood that affected how I ended up where I ended up.
Now, did you always know, or should I say, did you know early on that you were adopted?
I didn't. I had no idea. Although I absolutely knew I did not fit where I was. I knew that from a very young age. I grew up in a pretty robust family in Ohio. I grew up in Cincinnati. up until 78, and then I moved to Detroit. But in those early years in Cincinnati, I was surrounded by cousins and nephews and nieces and aunties and uncles and everybody around me at the time, and nobody looked like me. So after a while, you get told, well, you're light skinned, and your mama's light skinned, and so y'all look alike, and as a kid, I bought that for a little bit. But then around 76, my little brother was born. It's a miracle because she could not have kids full term, and all of a sudden she was able to have him. And when he comes out, he does not look like me, not even remotely like me. And so as he grew, it became more and more evident to me that we could not possibly be brothers. So I began to ask, like, why is it that John doesn't look like me? Why is it that we look so different? And then I'm looking at my cousins, and they don't look anything like me as we get older. And then finally, around the age of 11, they decided that they would tell me. And at that point, I didn't really know what that meant. It still didn't really land on me what adoption meant, other than that helped me understand why I didn't look like anybody else. But it didn't really land on me until much later that this wasn't actually my family. I mean, it was, but it was the only family I knew. But I didn't, it probably took me another 3 or 4 years before I realized, like, oh, we are not even blood. Even making those deeper connections around, I have ailments and issues that nobody in my family has. I have vision issues that nobody else in my family has. I was wearing glasses, nobody else in my family wore glasses. It was just really strange to see the distinctions grow over time. And when it got to that point, that's when it started to affect me in terms of how I connected with people, how I felt like I belonged, my sense of connectedness to my own history, questions that were starting to arise that they couldn't answer because it was a closed adoption.
So when they had this conversation with you at 11, and then you mentioned it took a few more years after that to really piece together what that means, at what point did you start to own this identity that I am an adoptee, I am adopted? Did you kind of just, take that information and not hide it, but not really promote this new fact of your identity?
I was aware of it. Actually, I'm going to pause for a second. Your earrings are banging on your.
Are they? Darn it!
I kept hearing something. I was like, "Where's that coming from?" And then I noticed where your microphone is.
Thank
you. Yeah. So it took me a while before I started to claim and openly state that I am adopted. I'm an adopted kid. There were a couple people in my high school who had expressed that they were adopted. And when I heard them say that, it was an open door to say, oh, me too. I didn't know anybody else had experienced this. It still felt like a very exclusive thing to me. Mm-hmm. There wasn't a community of adoptees in my life. There wasn't this sense of support. There wasn't any therapy. There was nothing. It was just, you're adopted. And that was it. So I had to make sense of it on my own. And when I found somebody at my high school who actually had experienced it or grew up knowing that he was adopted, he actually was in a foster care system for a long time, and he was adopted. Ironically, his name was Kevin too. And the family who adopted him was named Johnson. He just didn't change his name.
Wait a minute.
It was hilarious. It was hilarious because we both ran track, and his name is Kevin Duggar. And we cracked up about this because we found out that we were adopted around the same time. I found out that I was adopted, and then we kind of connected on the track field when we're training. He was like, yeah, I'm adopted too. And it's like, oh, what? And it just so happened that the people who adopted him, they were named Johnson. No relation at all, but we just ended up at the same high school, both named Kevin, last name Johnson, both adopted. And I think there was a problem in terms of how I communicated it to people. Because often when I would say I'm adopted, they would question, so how, the question was always awkward because it felt like something like, so are you going to keep your name?
Mm.
There was just all kinds of awkward questions like, wait, I only know one name. I don't have another name, but people had these questions that were coming from their own lack of knowledge about adoption, that often led me to be even more confused about my adoption because there were things that I simply did not have access to. I only knew that I was adopted and the date of that adoption. And so, as I grew up, there really wasn't much information to draw from. And my mother and I had a conversation one day when I was younger. I think I was still in high school. And she asked me not to do a search until after she passed away.
Mm.
And, in hindsight, I totally understand that. She had lost babies. I was her first child. And she'd had a baby since me. And she didn't really want to have to navigate that difficult space for herself. And as selfish as that is, I totally understand that. I think that's a human thing to want to protect yourself from that kind of exposure. But what it did for me is it kept it more of a secret, and it kept the process of me knowing about who I am postponed. So I think some resentment was created between me and her because I wanted to know who I was, and she didn't want to know anything beyond my adoption. So it created a little bit of a tension between the two of us along the way.
Interesting, actually, because there is just a lot of debate around when is the appropriate time to tell a child. And so you were told at 11, but then you're also going into this huge identity, phase of your life as an adolescent. So you're Black, you're male, you're adopted, you're a teenager. Like there's all these different things. It's like the perfect storm.
Yeah.
So in thinking about that, do you have any thoughts around whether or not a child should be told like straight away, or whether or not they should be told as they're older, when some adoptive parents would think that a child is quote unquote ready to handle that type of information, or dare I say the adopted parent is ready to be able to deal with exactly with what your mother was trying to avoid?
I think that's the discomfort that's at the root of that question. How comfortable a parent feels telling their child that they've been lying to them all this time. That's really the question that a parent is wrestling with, because that's what adoption is. At its core, it's taking a child into a home that is not theirs and treating them as if they are yours. And at its core, it's creating a false impression for that child. So I've taken the belief that age-appropriate communication about someone's adoption status as soon as possible. And you don't want to tell a 3-year-old you're adopted, you're not my child.
Right.
That's not age appropriate, right? But you want to make sure that the attachment is allowed to you. But as the child becomes older, let them know who they are and let them understand the context. As they become curious, keep answering their questions. And the last thing that I would recommend somebody to do is to maintain a facade that you're somebody's mother or father, when they're going to find out eventually that you're not.
Yeah.
And so what's that going to be like when they find out, versus if you've been telling them all along, you're very special to us. We were given the opportunity to be your parents, setting the right context for a child to be able to understand what their relationship actually is. And it's not easy. I'm not saying that's easy at all, but I think the easy way is the way that puts the child at risk later on. Avoiding that conversation in the early years puts that child at greater risk of alienation and social distancing, no pun intended, geez. Anyway, Yeah, anyway, but yeah, it creates this sense of not belonging and a sense of, disconnection when they find out at 11, 12, 13, 14 years old. And, Sandy, we've talked about this, that, some of us don't find out until we're full blown adults. And what does that do when we think back? Like all the things, all of our interactions start to come back into our consciousness, and we start to make sense. Like, oh, well, that totally, now it makes sense why I felt that way, or why I was treated that way, or why the language was so vague or inconsistent or incoherent. So I think it's important that we tell our kids the truth earlier and trust that they're resilient. Trust that our kids have the ability to process these things, and they may not be, they may not have the articulation of being able to totally understand every aspect of it, but kids get it. Kids get, the differences and the different dynamics of being a family. And as long as they know that they're loved and cared for, they don't really care. But when we create this falsehood narrative, up until we feel comfortable as parents to share the whole truth, it builds up such a false story. You can cause a kid to crack, and there's this, like you said, Dr. Sam, at a formative time when we're establishing our identity and establishing our independence and our self-expression, we get assaulted with a moment where we have to question our identity over and above the questioning that's already going on. And so while you might think that that's the great time because they're more mature now, it's actually probably the most fragile time to introduce an absence of identity to a child, to a young person. So that would be my answer to that one.
And you talked a bit about, and as you were discussing this, I was going back to my own place, and Sandy, I'm sure you can attest to this as well, but looking around at everyone, knowing that you do not fit in this equation. Like there is something about it you can't quite put your finger on. And I think it can at times go past what you look like or the resemblance. It's almost like my personality doesn't fit, my energy doesn't fit. Doesn't fit. And I think sometimes we place a lot of the blame right on our adoptive parents. But what are your thoughts about the rest of the family members that also play into this lie?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, all of my aunts and uncles, both sides of my mother and father's families, they all were complicit in the storytelling. And it's tough because, they mean well by the facade. They mean well to create a place that's hospitable for you, that makes you feel welcome. And yet there's something disconnected. And, yes, it's energy. Yes, it's somatic in a way, that how people hold their bodies when they're interacting with you, versus you watch them interact with somebody else and you're like, wow, they don't hug me that way. Or they don't really give me that kind of attention. And so those comparisons start to become these little micro aggressions that happen to an adoptee that the adoptee doesn't know what to do with. I have no idea what to do with that. It just feels a little weird. I have no context to resolve it with, or to respond, or even ask a question. Like, why do you treat them different from me? That feels very selfish. And in a socialized environment, what kid is going to do that? Unless they have Asperger's or something that just doesn't allow them to, express what's going on. Yeah. But for most kids, most of the adopted kids that I grew up around, they would never question that. Partially because it put at risk their belonging.
True.
And if in my mind, I think anything I do might make me feel more distant from a group, I'm not going to do that. And as a kid, that was like the center of my world. How do I say something that might alienate me from these people who I feel an affinity towards, but I don't necessarily feel like I fit. And so my aunts, my uncles, friends of the family that knew that I was adopted, they would never say it, you know. And it wasn't until I knew and they told everybody that I knew that people began to let those guards down, and I got to see them as they really are. And they interacted with me person to person, as opposed to the adopted child versus the child that was actually, you know, blood, you know. And it created a really interesting dynamic because me and my younger brother, we didn't really, there's no issue between us, and yet we were treated very differently by the family, by my father, by my mother, just treated differently. And in hindsight, it makes perfect sense. But in the moment, absolutely bewildering, because I couldn't make sense of why I felt that way, and I had no context for it.
I'm glad that we got on this topic because it makes me think about something that I've been wrestling with, this idea between adoption as a lie and adoption as omission. And I don't know if there's really a difference, but I think the way that I think about it for my situation is that, yeah, it's a lie, but was it just an act of omission? You know what I mean? Like, we're just going to omit how you came to be part of this family. So we're not necessarily lying to you, because I never came right out and asked, you know, am I adopted? Because who would ask that? I never had a reason to think that.
Right.
But at the same time, it's just, you know, is it omission, or is it really like, is it a lie? Is it just semantics? Is it just wording?
I think those are two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
Because it takes some intention. Omission could be like, oops, I didn't tell you that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but I think the intention is not malicious. And when you think of a lie, you might think it's malicious intent to mislead you. But isn't that what it is? I mean, it's an intent to not let you know that you came from outside of this family. And to deny you certain access to information that would help you identify that, or help you relate more effectively, or help you socialize more effectively. So there's, you know, it's nuance, of course. Some kids have a different experience of adoption. Some go through the foster care system, or they're cared for by multiple parents. So they don't have necessarily this illusion of belonging. They know that they don't belong in the family that they're in. Right. But for those of us who have been adopted by a single family at a young age, we don't have a memory that can challenge the experience that we're having. So we're in this hypnagogic state, you know, up until maybe 2 or 3 years old, and we start having memories. Well, I don't have any memories of the caregiver who took care of me at Catholic services. I have no memories of my birth mom because she gave me up the day that I was born. The only memories I really have are of the parents I grew up with. So I have that to compete with subliminally, subconsciously. But then I have this lived experience of dissonance. So there's just always this cognitive dissonance of something's not quite right. And I can't tell you what it is. And I can tell you I spent, I think I would say, starting around age 12, well through 18, I would wake up in the middle of the night and I would go down into my kitchen at our home in Detroit, and I would just stare out the window and cry. I had no idea why, but I look back on those years and I realized it was just this empty hunger trying to figure out what was wrong with me. And this is after I knew I was adopted, but I had no idea. This is a gap between 11 and 45, where I knew nothing more than I'm adopted. Mm. And at that time, I didn't know what to do with that. You know, I know this, but now what do I do? Mm. So, I mean, it may not be a lie by the classical sense. It might be omission. But for me, it still felt like a betrayal. Like, I know that you love me, But there's now a huge, it's even bigger. There's a bigger gap now that I knew something wasn't quite right, but now I know that it's not right and I have nowhere to go with it.
Right.
Full disclosure, Kevin is the person who introduced me to the book, The Primal Wound. So let's just start there. Like, that was a whole game changer for me, like, just to read literature that pretty much validates everything that I had experienced, you know, the first 38 years of my life before I knew I was adopted. But for you, Kevin, what happened to you at 45? So you mentioned, you know, this period between 11 and 45 where you really didn't know anything other than I'm adopted. What happened at 45?
Well, the laws in Ohio were where the records are sealed forever. So there was no disclosure unless I petitioned the court and someone on my family side petitioned the court. And both petitions asked for the release of those records. Now, the trick with that is my name on my birth certificate, my original birth certificate, is literally Infant Lambert. So who on my side of the family was going to know to particularly ask for Infant Lambert?
Right.
There was no possibility that that was going to happen from my mother's side of the family. And so I put in the petition over and over again for years, no responses. And I was a part of a number of adoption search groups, trying to just figure out, there was a bit of a, now here's a lie. My parents told me, possibly because they were told this, that a young couple, 18 and 19 years old from the military base, got pregnant, and the father didn't want to have the baby. The mother did. The mother decided to put me up for adoption. That was the story, 18 and 19 years old. So I used that to help facilitate a search process. So I was in all these adoption groups and search registries and looking left and right to figure out if there was any clues that I could glean from the social environment, you know, the interwebs. None of that panned out to anything. And then a lobbying group out of Ohio won their case to open up the adoption registry in Ohio. And this was in 2014. And they gave a year for the parents to redact their names from the birth certificates if they wanted to. And then the year after that year, they opened it up for adoptees to file, to have access to their records. So as soon as that time came along, I think it was like January 25th or something like that in 2015, I put in my petition. Within a month, actually 3 months, I got it in the mail. I saw it in the mailbox. I could not open it. I handed it to my daughter, who opened it up, and she read it to me. And we just sat outside my gate and just were crying. Like, wow. You know, I know my mother's name, Barbara Lambert. I know she was 32 years old in Toledo, where I knew I was born. And I knew a bunch of other things all of a sudden. They had very strange things on those birth certificates, by the way. Very, very uncomfortable information about my mother. But it was normal back then, so very weird. And so that gave me the last known home address at the date of my birth. So basically a 45-year-old address.
What?
That was the only connection that I could have, right? And I had no idea what to do with that. And so I was kind of in limbo for a couple of months trying to figure out, okay, so what do I do next? I know this, but I have no other points of contact. Who knows what's sitting there 45 years later, who's at that address? So then you all know I do coaching and training. So we were doing this training out in California, and I was with this group. And what we do at the end of our training weeks is we challenge each other to take something and act on it when we go back into the real world after the retreat's over with. And so they knew about this story because it was one of the things that I told them about myself at the beginning. And they asked me, they'd all gone around and given their commitments about what they were going to do when they get back with what they learned at the retreat. And I said, KJ, what are you going to do? And I sat there for a second. I thought, how about this? I'm going to take a day off next week. I'm going to drive down to Toledo to this address on my birth certificate. I'm going to see what I can find. And now I may not make it through this part. So that Tuesday, get in my car. I'm going to send you some pictures too. So if you want to add these to the video, it'll make it a little bit more interesting. I hopped in my car. I drove down there. Have you ever seen the movie Anastasia?
I haven't.
No.
The cartoon?
No.
Okay. It's great. See, so
I'm like, Sam, did you see it?
Y'all need to watch this. So that looks like, so I have daughters. So that's who I'm blaming on watching this movie. And we watch this movie all the time called Anastasia, about the Russian girl who was missing from the Romanov family, who was assassinated during the revolution. And no one ever seemed to know what happened to Anastasia. Well, this movie posits that she escaped somehow from the revolution, and she was in an orphanage for a number of years. And she finally went on a journey back to figure out who she was, because she had forgotten through some, amnesia, who she was. And so there's a song that Aaliyah does that I think she was nominated for a Grammy.
Yes, I remember the song. I didn't see the movie. I remember
the Journey to the Past.
Yes.
And the entire time I'm driving down there, I'm listening to that song.
Mm.
And it's a powerful song. And she sings it in a way that you would never think Aaliyah would sing. She's very different style from what we know her for. And so I get there. Oh, man. I get down to the apartment complex, and I drive up. I park right in front of the unit that I see in the picture, or in my birth certificate. And there are people coming in and out of it, and they're obviously not related to me. It was very clear to me. I went inside the apartment administration section, and I asked for some background. Like, I'm looking for my origin story. Could you help me out here? And none of those records were available to them digitally. They hadn't digitized any of those records back in the 70s. So I kind of given up, and I decided I'm going to go down to the courthouse, look through some records, see what I can find. I'm here. I'm going to stay as long as I need to figure out if I can dig up any information. So I asked a lady on my way out how long she lived in the building, in the apartment complex. And she said she'd been there for a good 15 years. I gave her a little insight about my journey. And she said, well, I don't know exactly how I can help you, but give me your number. And if I come across anything, I will definitely call you today. So I hopped in the car. I'm headed down to the courthouse to do some digging. I'm halfway to the courthouse, and this lady calls me. And she says, are you driving still? You might want to pull over. And she sends me a text with a link to a biography, to a what is it called? The death eulogy.
Not obituary, but
yes.
Okay.
So she calls me, and I'm trying to say this so you can edit it. So
we are not that high tech, Kevin.
Well, I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to just think like that. Well, yeah, she calls me and tells me, she sends me a text with the obituary link in it. And I'm looking at it. I'm like, no, I've already seen this picture. I've already looked, because when I got the birth certificate, I looked up her name. I did all those internet searches, all the different websites you can pay $29 and find out all you can about somebody. I'd done that search, and I hadn't found anything. I found this picture, but her description in my search results didn't really match up to what the birth certificate said. But this time, I see this picture, and I know I've seen her before. I counted her out. She looks like she's Italian. It just didn't register to me at all. I read the bio, I read the obituary, and it has the exact same number of children that my mother is listed as having in the obituary, in the birth certificate. It even went as far as to say that she lost a child. And the birth certificate said that she lost a child as well. And that's what got me. And I wasn't quite sold on her picture, but I went to the funeral home that posted the obituary. And I'm sitting in front of the lady who's the director of the funeral home. And she's giving me kind of like the side eye look every time I'm looking at her. And I don't quite know why. And we sit down at her desk. She said, okay, so who are you looking for again? I tell her, and she's looking through it, and she sees it, and she looks at me again. She goes, "You're Brad's brother." And I was like, who? Like she's saying it all like I know. You're Brad's brother. And well, tell me more. Yeah. He is, he's one of 4 other kids. Your mom passed away here about a couple of years ago. So she passed away like the year before they changed the law. But also she recognized her because my older sister passed away the same year. They both had cancer, and they both passed away within about a year of each other. And so she worked with the family extensively over that time frame. And she looks at me and she says, "You know what? I could get in trouble for this, but you need this." And she writes out his name, his address, his phone number. You need to go see them. First of all, I couldn't hardly get up from the chair because I'm sitting there like, I literally came here on a whim. I had no idea. This is like, I got there at 12:30. This happened around 2.
Wow.
So within an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours of me arriving in Dayton, Ohio, or Toledo, Ohio, I had the name and address of my brother. And I'm sitting in the parking lot, and Andrea texts me like, "What's going on? You gotta let me know what's going on." My oldest daughter. And I'm like, "I just found out my brother's name, and I have the address, and I'm sitting outside of his house." I was literally parked in front of his house. Now, at the time, I was driving a really bright orange Land Rover, and it probably wasn't the most inconspicuous car to drive around Dayton or Toledo.
Not so much.
Yeah. So I'm parked out front, and I was there for a good 10 minutes, just like, what do I do? I'm like, right here, I can see the front door of this guy's house. I have no idea how I'm gonna approach it. And so Andrea's like, you gotta go. Okay, I'm dropping my keys. I'm leaving the car running. I mean, I was a mess. I get out and I look out, and a woman in a red dress is standing at the doorway now, which of course, because I'm parked in front of her house for 10 minutes and not doing anything. And so I get out the car. Okay, here it is. And to this day, I really wish I'd have brought a crew with me to just follow me and video the whole thing, because it was surreal from the moment I got to Toledo to this point. I'm walking up this swervy pathway up to their front door, and she's standing in there behind the screen door. And I say, I'm Kevin Anthony Johnson, and I just was given a birth certificate that tells me that Barbara Ann Lambert is my mom. And she got big-eyed, and she opened the door up, and she said, "Oh my God, we never thought we'd get to meet you."
Oh, wow.
And just Niagara Falls, we all just started crying right there, and she opened her arms up and hugged me, and it was an unbelievably surreal moment. And then she took me out back where Brad was mowing the lawn. And I wish I had a picture I could pull up and show you guys right now. I wish I had thought about that. But it just so happened that we were both bald-headed, wearing white t-shirts with light blue jeans and white gym shoes. We both looked exactly the same, dressed exactly the same.
Wow.
On the day that we met.
Did that not freak you out?
I was totally freaked out. I was totally freaked out.
To see somebody who looks just like you.
It was weird. It was eerie. We stared at each other for a good minute and a half. And then, Marilyn looked at us like, okay, yeah, y'all brothers. And we sat down and had some tea and looked at pictures and talked for another couple hours before I had to drive back to Chicago. But that began a series of reunions that they hosted. I got introduced to other cousins and other family members. Come to find out that one of my cousins, I grew up watching her on TV.
So your whole family is just always on
her
TV.
name, yeah. She was one of the first black. She was one of the first black reporters, newscasters on Channel 7 in Detroit.
Wow.
And Charlene, I grew up watching her on the news, and then I go to this reunion, and she's sitting on the couch over there, and I'm thinking, why do I know her from? Where do I know her from? And then it hit me like, Charlene, I grew up watching you on TV. And she's like, yeah, I know. And it was just an amazing experience. Now that's my mother's side of the family. Fast forward to last year, and I've been on 23andMe probably since they started, because I was just like, I need to know more about myself. I still didn't, up until 2015, I didn't know much of anything. I think I was on 23andMe just a little bit before that. And so my information had been out there. I'd made a couple of connections with cousins, distant cousins, and one first cousin in California, who we thought was related to my mother's sisters in some way. And that was our speculation. But in January, I got this notification from 23andMe that said, hey, we found a new genetic match. And I go look, and it says half-sister, paternal. Now, nobody on my mother's side knew who my father was. There was speculation. 2 or 3 different people could have been the person, but nobody was sure. Nobody had seen her dating anybody around the time that I would have been conceived. And so now this is a paternal half-sister. We chatted really quickly on there, got on a Skype call, talked for almost 2 hours that night that we matched. Come to find out, his name is Jerry Harvey. And because Jerry was kind of a ladies' man, they affectionately call all of his kids Jerry's kids. Like telethon. Yeah, exactly. And so when my picture got sent out to all the other siblings on my father's side, and they were like, I think we have another Jerry's kids. I think we found another Jerry's kid. And all of a sudden, I get pictures back. Andrea's done the research. She found my brothers on Facebook. They look so much like me, it's kind of eerie. And it all of a sudden, and this gets back to the whole, sense of belonging and connection. Seeing my face in my brother's face on my mother's side was transformative. I can't even fully articulate how it felt to see myself for the first time in someone else's face. At 45 years old, I was seeing myself for the first time. And then just a few years later, to meet my sister and my brothers and another sister from Hawaii and another sister who lives in Toledo, to find out that literally I have 11 siblings across these 2 families.
Wow.
And to see their faces and to interact with them finally, just mind-blowing. And it was almost like I couldn't feel the way I used to feel. Like whatever it was that I was missing, I couldn't find it anymore. It just wasn't even available to me to experience anymore. And it's one of the hardest things to articulate. But it's like if there was a cloud there, the cloud wasn't there. And I never knew that it wasn't there. It just wasn't there one day. And all of a sudden, I can actually experience more of myself because I have this connection now. And it's been beautiful. I've been out to Hawaii to visit my sister out there. I've been to Austin, Texas, where actually, ironically, my brother from Toledo, he moved to Austin, Texas. 5 years later, I find out that my sister from my father's side lives in Austin, Texas as well. So when I went down there to visit my sister for the first time, I also hung out with my brother, who I met for the first time back in 2015. So all of this stuff has just come full circle for me. And it's just been this amazing journey to experience.
I'm trying to figure out who's going to play Kevin in a movie, because this is a whole movie right here. That is incredible.
There's a lot of drama in there.
Yeah. I mean, it would have to be in a saga, such as this. What I really want to touch base on now is just what you've been saying, like what you said about seeing your face in your brother's face. So if we think about moving into fatherhood for you,
yeah,
what was it like to see your face in your children's face? Were these your first blood relatives that you had ever met, or had you had your reunion? You hadn't had your reunion prior? No.
Well, yeah. At the point that I met Brad in 2015, my daughter was already, I think, in college. Well, no, was she in college? I think she was just out of college.
Okay.
Or almost out of college at that point. So at that point, my three kids were well into their teens or early teens. And I think a lot of my drive in my younger years was to build a family of my own, and create the kind of family environment that either I didn't have or that I envisioned that wasn't possible for me when I was growing up. And so my kids really were the first experience of me seeing myself in another human being. And I think that created really strong bonds for me with them. And that, in a way, I had to be careful about that, because it could also be very conducive to codependency.
Yeah.
For me to only see myself in them and not develop a self of my own was high risk, and I was aware of that risk, not early on, but as they grew up, I became aware of some of these ideas, and seeing some of those patterns starting to emerge, I knew I needed to do some work around differentiating myself from my children and giving them the space that they needed to be who they were apart from me. And that's been a dance ever since realizing that. But being their father helped me understand my identity more distinctly than ever, because I realized that I could be the father that I wanted to be. I didn't have to be the father that somebody else was. I didn't have to repeat the sins of my father's past. I could define that for myself.
Just marinating on that. Just marinating.
Yeah, the whole parenting piece for me, like Samantha and I talked about this in a video we did for Mother's Day, where I just shared how the idea of motherhood has always been tricky for me. I've been fearful of it. And I think part of it does stem from the early separation from my birth mother. So it's just interesting to hear how you frame it in your perspective, that almost like you had this drive, like you had this hope of, this is the type of family that I can create, rather than operating from this place of fear. Will I be a good father? Will I be connected to my children? Just different things like that. So I really appreciate your perspective on that.
Yeah. I mean, I had other fears that were rooted to my upbringing, and those were more financial they were provision related, like can I provide as a father? Those are probably the ones that I carried more than can I be a good father. I had a sense that I could be a good father, but I think I always struggled, and in some ways I still wrestle with that particular aspect of my fatherhood and manhood around my ability to provide adequately for my children. Um, and that's rooted in my experience in that family. You know, my family was, it, although it started out very well off, my dad was a Ford Motor executive for a number of years, almost 20 years. He worked for Ford, very high up in the organization, very influential. Um, but he got fired well into his 40s, and he didn't even have his degree. He started when he was very young, and it forced our family into eviction, bankruptcy, homelessness, homelessness for a couple of years. So you layer being adopted, finding out that I have been adopted, then going through financial turmoil and got kicked out of college from Michigan State University because of the financial situation, being homeless for a couple of years, and then deciding I need to take control of my life. You know, which as an adoptee is kind of challenging to make those navigations, because control is kind of an interesting dynamic of being an adoptee. You know, how much control did I have over my life up until this point? You know, at what point do I start making decisions that don't have the impact of being adopted? At what point do I start writing a different story about my adoption versus I'm subject to someone else's choices, or I'm just tossed around from here to here? Am I a commodity? Am I a responsibility? You also add the layer of my father was probably not the most enlightened human being on the planet. He was very intelligent, but often he would call me a ward of the state when he was angry. I didn't know what that meant at 8, 9, 10 years old, but I sure did know what it meant at 15. And so there are all kinds of nuances and dynamics of the family that made me who I am. And so when it became time for me to become a father, I had to wrestle with all of that stuff, you know, the financial aspects of it, the self-esteem, the power of my words as a father, my own fears around my ability to be a good father. I saw what it was like to be prosperous, but I also saw what it was like to be, to have nothing in the first 20 years of my life. So what was I going to do now that I had the ability to be a father and create my own family? So there was a lot of stuff that I was wrestling with in those early years. Then later on being married, later on being a minister in the church, later on having marital problems and a divorce, all that stuff starts to come into play in terms of how I feel as someone who yearns to belong, someone who yearns to fit somewhere, someone who yearns to make a contribution somewhere, and I see my fathering as probably the way that I can most make that influence happen at that point in my life. And then later on in life, I was able to achieve some other career aspirations, but at its core, being a father was one of the first ways that I knew to make sense of my life.
And so thinking about other Black male adoptees, again, whether they are from foster care or from private agencies, what would be your advice for these men in terms of going on a fatherhood journey and being successful at that despite the adoptee status?
As soon as you possibly can, get in front of a therapist. Have somebody to talk to. Have someone who is trained in how to help you navigate your mental and emotional space so that you can make sense of the storm that's going on inside of you. And even if there is no storm that you're aware of, treat it like a dentist. You would you would not go 5 years without seeing somebody about your teeth. This is just as important, if not more so. So having someone who has the skill and the capability to help you navigate your assumptions about yourself, your assumptions about life, your assumptions about how the world works, and how your mind interprets those things and the meaning that we've made of our history and our present. All of those things help us become the man that we want to be. And I know in the Black community, therapy and psychology, psychiatry is somewhat, lowbrow. Like, why would I do that? But the truth is that there are now a lot of very competent Black therapists and psychologists and psychiatrists and helping professionals who know how to help us navigate, who know the context of trauma, who know the context of family dysfunction, and can help make sense of it with us. And I would tell anyone who wants to be a father, any Black man in general, start by sitting with someone who can help you navigate who you are. Because so many times we as men, we embody the archetypes, but we don't understand ourselves. So we'll embody an archetype of a baller or a pimp or a drug dealer or a basketball player or some other archetype of a Black professional, big lawyer or a CEO or all these boss archetypes out there. But all those archetypes are masks that protect us from being really seen for who we are as Black men. And so the vulnerability of taking that mask off is what most Black men don't want to do when it comes to therapy. Because therapy will actually take that mask away. It doesn't matter who you are in front of a therapist. It doesn't matter what you've accomplished in your life. You could be the most successful CEO in history and be an absolute jerk and a horrible father at the same time. Because you could be denying yourself the awareness that would help you relate more effectively. So that's where I would start.
I think that's a perfect place to end. Kevin Anthony Johnson, thank you for your transparency, your candor. Thank you for allowing us to see you, and just tapping into this important conversation. Like we mentioned at the top of the call, we don't really get to hear voices like yours. We don't really hear Black male adoptees. So thank you for stepping up to the challenge, and happy Father's Day.
Happy
Thank you.
Father's Day.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure to talk about this with you all. Dr. Sam, Sandy, I really appreciate you asking me to be a part of this.
Of course, of course.
We know that you're a coach, so please let our listeners know where they can find out more about you and your services and make connections with you via social media.
The best place to catch me is on Instagram nowadays. So that's at Coach KJ. And there's a link tree on my bio and that on my Instagram profile that will lead you to everything else that I'm doing.
Thank you so much. Well, that's it. And for us, please follow us at Black to the Beginning on Instagram or Facebook. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. We look forward to seeing you next time.